In 1960, Princess Margaret, sister to Queen Elizabeth II, received a plot of land as a wedding gift on the private Caribbean island of Mustique. By 1972, she'd built Les Jolies Eaux, a 5-bedroom villa worth approximately £75,000 then. That's $2.1 million in today's money. But here's what shocks people. By 1999, Margaret stopped visiting entirely. She abandoned it, left it to decay. A $2.1 million Caribbean paradise, just sitting empty. For 17 years, she refused to return. And when she died in 2002, the property sold immediately to Jim Murray, an American businessman, for £2.4 million, about $9.5 million in today's dollars. The question everyone asks, why would a princess exile herself from her own tropical mansion? The official story says health problems, strokes, mobility issues. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason involves scandal, betrayal, public humiliation, and a transformation so complete that her paradise became her prison. And here's what no one's talking about. This wasn't just about romance or tabloids. This was about how a single location can absorb so much pain that returning becomes psychologically impossible. Think about it. Margaret had unlimited resources. She could have renovated, redecorated, changed everything about the villa to make new memories. But she didn't. She simply abandoned it. And that abandonment tells us something profound about human psychology, about trauma, about how places can become permanently contaminated by the events that happen there. If you're ready to see what really happened behind the palace walls, let's begin. Let's start with how Margaret got Mustique in the first place. In 1960, Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, bought the entire island of Mustique for £45,000. That's $1.8 million today. The island was 1,400 acres of undeveloped Caribbean land. No electricity, no running water, just beaches and scrubland. But Tennant saw potential. He'd inherited a fortune from his family's chemical business and wanted to create something extraordinary. His vision was simple: build an exclusive retreat for aristocrats and celebrities, a place where the world's elite could escape without being disturbed. No hotels, no tourists, just private villas and absolute discretion. When Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, in 1960, Tennant offered her a 10-acre plot as a wedding gift. The location was perfect: Britannia Bay, on the southwest coast, with views of the Caribbean Sea and neighboring islands. But here's what's interesting. Margaret didn't accept immediately. She was skeptical. The island was primitive. Getting there required multiple flights and a boat journey. There were no facilities. Tennant convinced her by describing his vision. Within 10 years, he promised, Mustique would have electricity, running water, an airstrip, and a small community of like-minded aristocrats. Margaret agreed. She accepted the land, but she didn't build immediately. She visited occasionally, camping on the beach, swimming, enjoying absolute privacy. And during those early visits, something happened. Margaret fell in love with the island, not just the beauty, the freedom. Because here's the critical point. Margaret needed this escape. As the younger sister to the Queen, Margaret lived under constant scrutiny. Every outfit analyzed, every relationship examined, every decision questioned. She was born in 1930, the second daughter of King George VI. When her uncle abdicated in 1936, her father became king, and her sister Elizabeth became heir to the throne. Margaret grew up knowing she'd never be queen. She'd always be secondary, always supporting, always watched, but never in control. Her romantic life had already been a disaster. In the 1950s, she'd fallen in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced royal equerry. The Church of England forbade the marriage. The royal family opposed it. The government intervened. Margaret was forced to choose: marry Townsend and lose her royal title and income, or stay in the family and give him up. She chose duty over love. The relationship ended in 1955. It destroyed her. By 1960, when she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, she was already damaged, already compromised, already living a life of obligations rather than desires. Armstrong Jones was a photographer, talented, artistic, charming. but he was also ambitious, competitive, unfaithful. By 1963, just 3 years into their marriage, he was having affairs. Margaret knew. She confronted him. He denied it. Their marriage became a performance. They appeared together at royal events. They smiled for cameras. They maintained appearances. But privately, they were miserable. By 1970, Margaret's marriage to Snowden was already crumbling. They fought constantly. He had affairs. She felt trapped. And that's when Mustique became essential. Not just as a vacation spot, as a psychological necessity. So, in 1972, Margaret commissioned architect Oliver Messel to design Les Jolies Eaux, beautiful waters in French. Messel was perfect for the project. He was a renowned theatrical designer who'd worked on opera sets, films, and country estates. His vision for Les Jolies Eaux was pure romance. Balinese-inspired pavilions with open walls, allowing Caribbean breezes to flow through. The construction cost £75,000, about $2.1 million today. But that figure is misleading. It doesn't include the infrastructure Tenant built to support it. To construct Les Jolies Eaux, Tenant first had to bring electricity to that section of the island, install water systems, build access roads, bring construction materials from mainland. The actual cost of enabling Margaret's villa was closer to £120,000, about $3.4 million today. Tenant absorbed these costs personally. He considered it an investment in Mustique's prestige. Having Princess Margaret as a property owner made the island more attractive to potential buyers. The villa featured 5 bedrooms, each with ensuite bathrooms, an open-air living room with soaring ceilings, a swimming pool surrounded by tropical gardens, terraces overlooking Britannia Bay. The design was pure theatrical romance, Balinese-inspired with pavilions, terraces, and lush gardens. But here's what made it special: the attention to detail. Messel designed custom furniture for every room, hand-carved wooden screens, ceramic tiles imported from Portugal, fabrics from India. Margaret decorated with antiques she'd collected over years, local art from Caribbean artists, vibrant colors, pink, turquoise, yellow, coral. She placed a grand piano in the living room, installed a fully stocked bar, created a library filled with books on art, history, and poetry. This wasn't just a house. This was her statement of independence. This was Margaret saying, "I may be trapped in London, but here, I'm free." Between 1972 and 1976, Margaret spent weeks at Mustique every winter. Typically, she'd arrive in late December or early January and stay until February or March. She'd bring an entourage, lady-in-waiting, private secretary, personal maid, sometimes a hairdresser. But she'd also invite friends, real friends, not royal hangers-on, musicians like Mick Jagger and his wife Bianca, who'd bought property on Mustique in 1972. Artists like Patrick Litchfield, her cousin and a famous photographer, writers, designers, actors, people who treated her like Margaret, not your Royal Highness. Colin Tennant threw elaborate parties, costume balls where everyone dressed as pirates or 18th-century courtiers, beach barbecues with local musicians, moonlit boat rides. The guest list was carefully curated. International celebrities, European aristocrats, successful artists, people who valued discretion and understood royal protocol without being obsequious about it. Margaret could wear jeans, swim topless, dance freely. Nobody judged her, or rather, nobody here judged her. The British press called it Mustique life, a bohemian paradise where royals acted like regular people. And they weren't entirely wrong. During these years, Margaret's daily routine on Mustique was remarkably ordinary. She'd wake around 10 a.m., have breakfast on the terrace, fresh fruit, coffee, toast. Then she'd spend hours by the pool or beach, swimming, sunbathing, reading. She particularly loved reading. She'd go through a book every 2 or 3 days, historical biographies, modern novels, art history. Lunch was usually light, salads, grilled fish, local vegetables. Afternoons were for socializing. She'd visit Colin Tennant's Cotton House Hotel for drinks, or friends would visit her villa. Evenings started with cocktails around 7 p.m. Margaret preferred whiskey, famous grouse specifically. She'd have 2 or 3 before dinner. Dinner was formal, even on Mustique. She'd change into evening wear. The table would be properly set, china, crystal, silver. Her cook, A local woman named Basil Charles prepared Caribbean-influenced meals with European touches, fresh seafood, local produce, imported wines. After dinner, the party would begin. Music, dancing, more drinking, cigarettes, conversation lasting until 2 or 3 a.m. Margaret would play piano. She was genuinely talented. She particularly loved show tunes and jazz standards. This was her element. This was where she was happiest. During these years, Margaret spent approximately 12 weeks annually on Mustique. That's 25% of her winters. The villa employed 4 full-time staff year-round: a cook, housekeeper, gardener, and maintenance worker. Each earned approximately £3,000 annually, about $42,000 today. Annual operating costs ran about £30,000 yearly, approximately $420,000 today. This included staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, supplies, food, alcohol, and regular upkeep. But here's what people don't realize. Margaret didn't own this property free and clear. She owned the land gifted by tenant. But maintaining a Caribbean villa required constant cash flow, and Margaret's annual income from the civil list was £95,000, about $1.3 million today. The civil list was the annual payment from the British government to support royal duties. After taxes, staff salaries for her London residence in Kensington Palace, clothing for royal appearances, and other obligations, Margaret had approximately £40,000 in discretionary income. Of that, £30,000 went to Mustique. That's 75% of her discretionary income. She was essentially spending 3/4 of her personal money on a property she used 12 weeks per year. Financially, it made no sense. But she didn't care, because Mustique represented freedom. The freedom to be Margaret, not Her Royal Highness. The freedom to love whom she wanted, drink when she wanted, live how she wanted. The freedom to be imperfect, human, real. But that freedom was about to become her downfall, and the person who would trigger that downfall was already on the island. Now, let's look at how paradise turned into scandal. In 1973, Margaret's marriage to Lord Snowdon was effectively over. They lived separate lives. He had affairs. She felt abandoned. The marriage had become intolerable. Snowdon was cruel, not physically, but psychologically. He'd make cutting remarks about her weight, mock her public speaking, criticize her friends. He'd disappear for days, claiming work commitments. Margaret knew he was with other women. She confronted him multiple times. He'd apologize, promise to change, then do it again. By 1973, they barely spoke. They maintained separate bedrooms in Kensington Palace. They only appeared together for official functions. Margaret was lonely, depressed, drinking more heavily. That's when she met Roddy Llewellyn. Roddy was 25 years old. Margaret was 43. He was a landscape gardener from an aristocratic family. His father was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Llewellyn, a Welsh Olympic gold medalist in equestrian sports. Roddy was handsome, tall, with long hair and a gentle demeanor, charming, artistic, sensitive, but he was also struggling financially. Despite his aristocratic background, Roddy had little money. He'd tried various careers. He'd worked in restaurants, attempted music, dabbled in gardening. Nothing stuck. He was, in many ways, adrift. They met at a house party in Scotland, hosted by Colin Tennant in September 1973. Tennant loved playing matchmaker. He'd invited Roddy specifically because he thought Margaret would like him. He was right. The attraction was immediate. Margaret was captivated by Roddy's youth, his gentleness, his artistic sensibility. Roddy was flattered by royal attention. Here was Princess Margaret, sophisticated, cultured, glamorous, showing interest in him. They talked for hours that first night about music, art, life. Margaret felt understood in a way she hadn't in years. By 1974, Margaret invited Roddy to Mustique. This invitation was significant. Mustique was Margaret's private sanctuary. She didn't bring just anyone. Roddy accepted immediately. And here's where everything changed. When Roddy first arrived at Les Jolies Eaux in January 1974, he was overwhelmed. He'd never experienced anything like this: the villa, the views, the luxury, the freedom. And Margaret was different here, relaxed, funny, affectionate. In London, she was Princess Margaret, formal, careful, constrained. On Mustique, she was just Margaret, swimming, laughing, playing piano until 3 a.m. Roddy fell in love, not just with Margaret, with the entire lifestyle. For the next 2 years, Roddy became a regular guest at Les Jolies Eaux. He'd stay for weeks at a time. They'd swim together, sunbathe together, sleep together. They had a routine: wake late, breakfast on the terrace, beach in the afternoon, drinks in the evening, music at night. Margaret would play piano while Roddy sang. His voice was decent. He'd harbored dreams of being a folk singer. They'd take boat trips to neighboring islands, have picnics on deserted beaches, dance barefoot in the villa's living room. Colin Tennant encouraged the relationship. He liked Roddy. He thought Margaret deserved happiness. Other Mustique residents were supportive. Mick Jagger and Bianca welcomed Roddy. Patrick Litchfield found him pleasant. It seemed perfect. But there was a massive problem. Margaret was still married, and the royal family absolutely forbade public affairs. The unspoken rule was simple: if you must have affairs, be discreet. Never get caught. Never create scandal. Margaret understood this. She'd watched her family navigate scandals before. So Margaret and Roddy tried to keep things private. They were discreet in London, careful about appearances. When in Britain, Roddy would visit Kensington Palace late at night, using a side entrance. He'd leave early in the morning. They never appeared together at public events, never dined at fashionable restaurants, never gave interviews. But on Mustique, they relaxed. They acted like a normal couple. They'd hold hands walking on the beach, kiss in public, swim together in the pool. Margaret thought Mustique's isolation protected them. She was wrong, because other people visited Mustique too, and some of them talked. By late 1975, rumors were circulating in London society. Princess Margaret was having an affair with a young gardener. The tabloid press was investigating. They'd heard the rumors. They wanted proof. And that's exactly what they got. In February 1976, a British journalist named Ross Waby traveled to Mustique. He posed as a tourist. He rented a boat. He positioned himself offshore from Les Jolies Eaux. And he waited. On February 24, 1976, Margaret and Roddy went to the beach. It was a perfect Caribbean day, sunny, warm, breezy. Margaret wore a bikini, Roddy wore swimming trunks. They were clearly intimate, touching, laughing, completely comfortable with each other. Ross Waby used a telephoto lens. He took dozens of photographs. Margaret and Roddy swimming, sunbathing, walking hand in hand, Margaret lying with her head on Roddy's lap. The intimacy was undeniable. These weren't just friends. This was a couple. Waby left Mustique immediately. He flew to London. He contacted News of the World, Britain's biggest tabloid newspaper. The photos sold for £30,000, about $420,000 today. News of the World's editors were ecstatic. This was explosive. Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, caught in an affair with a man 18 years younger. They planned the publication carefully. Front page, maximum impact. The headline screamed, "The Queen's Sister and the Toy Boy." The photos ran on February 27, 1976. The scandal was immediate, explosive, devastating. Within hours, every newspaper in Britain was covering the story. The Daily Mail called it the most damaging royal scandal in decades. The Sun ran the headline, "Royal Shame." The Times, normally restrained, published a scathing editorial about royal responsibility. Television news led with the story. Radio discussed it. Magazines rushed special editions to print. The British public was shocked. The royal family was humiliated. The press went into feeding frenzy. Remember, this was 1976. Britain was still relatively conservative. Divorce was scandalous. Affairs were shameful. The sexual revolution of the 1960s had happened, but societal attitudes, especially regarding royalty, remained traditional. And here was a princess, the Queen's own sister, photographed with a man 18 years younger while still married. The age gap particularly scandalized people. The term "toy boy" was deliberately demeaning. It suggested Margaret was using Roddy as a sexual plaything. Within days, the story dominated every newspaper. TV news covered it constantly. Radio shows invited experts to discuss the Margaret problem. Comedians made jokes. Political cartoons mocked her. Opinion polls measured public reaction. Margaret's approval ratings plummeted. Polls showed 62% of Britons disapproved of her behavior. 27% called for her to be removed from the civil list, stripped of her government income. Letters to newspapers were brutal. She's a disgrace. Throw her out of the royal family. She should be ashamed. But some defended her. Feminists argued she had a right to personal happiness. Modernizers said royal rules were outdated. The debate raged for weeks. Buckingham Palace refused to comment. The Queen said nothing publicly. But privately, she was furious, not just about the affair, about the photographs, about the public humiliation. The Queen valued discretion above all else. Margaret's behavior was the opposite: public, visible, embarrassing. Lord Snowdon, Margaret's husband, was contacted for comment. He said nothing. He was embarrassed, but not surprised. Their marriage was dead anyway. Privately, Snowdon was actually relieved. The scandal gave him justification to leave. But here's the real problem. Mustique had now become synonymous with scandal. The villa that represented freedom now represented shame. Every article about Margaret mentioned Mustique. Every photograph was captioned "at her Caribbean villa." Les Jolies Eaux was no longer a private sanctuary. It was a public symbol of Margaret's moral failing. Every time Margaret returned to Mustique, the press followed. Photographers camped on neighboring islands with telephoto lenses. Charter boats would position themselves offshore. Tourists would try to catch glimpses. What had been private became public. What had been sacred became violated. The paradise was poisoned. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret couldn't stop going. Because where else could she go? Let's examine what happened after the scandal broke. For Margaret, returning to Mustique after February 1976 was complicated. She'd been exposed, humiliated, publicly shamed. But she also desperately needed escape from London, where paparazzi stalked her constantly. Photographers camped outside Kensington Palace. They followed her car. They took pictures at every public appearance. One photographer famously shouted, "Where's Roddy, ma'am?" as Margaret attended a charity event. She ignored him, but the humiliation was evident. So in winter 1976-77, Margaret returned to Les Jolies Eaux. It was December 1976, 10 months after the scandal. She arrived hoping things would be different. That time had healed the wound, that Mustique could still be her sanctuary. But everything had changed. Now, when she arrived, journalists were waiting at the airstrip. Photographers were positioned offshore. Boats circled outside Britannia Bay. Every movement was documented. When she went to the beach, photographed. When she drank at the Cotton House Hotel, photographed. When Roddy visited, which he did because they were still together, photographed extensively. The January 1977 photographs ran with headlines like, "They're back," and Margaret's defiant return. The coverage was relentless. Colin Tennant tried to help. He issued a formal statement. Journalists were not welcome on Mustique. He threatened legal action against trespassers. He hired private security to patrol the island. He contacted boat rental companies, asking them not to rent to known photographers. But Mustique was accessible by water. You couldn't stop photographers with telephoto lenses from nearby islands or international waters. The privacy Margaret had treasured was gone. Completely gone. And it changed how she experienced the villa. Before, she'd walk freely around the property, swim in the pool, sunbathe on the terrace. Now, she was constantly aware of being watched. She'd scan the horizon for boats, stay inside when she saw suspicious vessels. She couldn't relax, couldn't let her guard down. The villa had become a fishbowl, beautiful but exposed. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on Margaret to end her marriage officially. The royal family wanted resolution. The public wanted clarity. Even Margaret knew the marriage was over. In March 1976, just weeks after the scandal, Buckingham Palace announced that Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were separating. The statement was brief, formal. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, and the Earl of Snowdon have mutually agreed to live apart. It acknowledged what everyone already knew, but it made the failure official. The separation meant Margaret and Snowdon lived completely separately. No joint appearances, no pretense of unity. The actual divorce took longer. British law required a 2-year separation before divorce could be granted. During those 2 years, 1976 to 1978, Margaret was in limbo. Still married but separated, still royal but disgraced, still wealthy but emotionally bankrupt. The divorce finalized on May 24, 1978. This made Margaret the first senior royal to divorce since Princess Victoria Melita in 1901, 77 years earlier. The divorce settlement took months to negotiate. Snowdon received approximately £100,000, about $1.4 million today. He also received custody arrangements for their two children, David, Viscount Linley, born 1961, and Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones, born 1964. The children, aged 17 and 14, primarily lived with Margaret but visited Snowdon regularly. Margaret kept Les Jolies Eaux, but at what cost? Because here's what nobody talks about. The divorce didn't end the scandal. It amplified it. Now Margaret was a divorced princess openly dating a younger man. The press coverage intensified. Between 1976 and 1978, Margaret appeared on tabloid covers 127 times. That's more than twice weekly. Stories claimed she was drunk, depressed, reckless, out of control. Margaret's downward spiral, the sad princess, royal embarrassment. Some stories were true. Margaret was drinking heavily during this period. She smoked 60 cigarettes daily. She'd gained weight. Some stories were exaggerated. Claims she was constantly drunk were false. She was functional, attending royal duties. Some stories were completely fabricated. Rumors about drug use, for instance, were baseless, but they all had one thing in common: Mustique. Every scandal story mentioned the villa. Every photograph referenced the island. Every rumor connected to Les Jolies Eaux. The villa had become a symbol, not of freedom anymore, but of failure, failed marriage, failed discretion, failed dignity. And Margaret began to realize something devastating. She couldn't escape her own escape. Mustique was supposed to be where she fled from judgment. Now it was where judgment found her. The psychological impact was profound. In 1978, Margaret visited Mustique only twice, down from 12 weeks in previous years. First visit, January 1978, for 2 weeks. She seemed restless. Staff noticed she wasn't sleeping well. She'd wake early, pace the villa, drink alone. Second visit, November 1978, for 10 days. She left early, claiming she needed to return to London for royal duties. But that wasn't true. She had no scheduled duties. She just couldn't stay anymore. Colin Tennant noticed. He visited her at the villa during the November trip. "Margaret, is something wrong?" he asked. "Everything's fine," she said, but her eyes were red. She'd been crying. "You seem uncomfortable here. This is your home, your sanctuary." "It was," Margaret said quietly, "but too much has happened." Tennant didn't press further, but he understood. Because every time Margaret walked into Les Jolies Eaux, she remembered. She remembered the photographs, the headlines, the humiliation. She remembered how her sanctuary had been invaded, how her privacy had been stolen, and worse, she remembered that this was where her relationship with Roddy had flourished. Which brings us to the next devastating chapter. Now let's talk about what happened to Margaret's relationship with Roddy Llewellyn. By 1979, they'd been together for 6 years, and on the surface, things seemed fine. Roddy still visited Mustique. They still spent time together in London. They still attended parties. But the relationship was fraying, because the relationship was always unequal. Margaret was royalty. Roddy was a gardener. Margaret was wealthy. Roddy struggled financially. Margaret was 49. Roddy was 31. And the age gap was starting to show, not physically. Roddy was still handsome. Margaret was still attractive. But psychologically, experientially, Margaret had lived a full life, marriage, children, decades of royal duty, international travel. Roddy was still finding himself, still figuring out what he wanted to do professionally, still exploring who he was. Margaret wanted stability, companionship, someone to share her life. Roddy wanted freedom, opportunity, a chance to build his own identity. And dating Princess Margaret made all that impossible. He couldn't get gardening work because potential clients thought he was only famous for sleeping with royalty. "Why would we hire him?" one potential client said. "He's Princess Margaret's boyfriend, not a real gardener." He couldn't pursue music seriously because people thought it was a vanity project funded by Margaret. He couldn't date other women because the press watched constantly. He couldn't build a life because Margaret's scandal defined him. The public perception was brutal. Roddy was a toy boy, a kept man, a gigolo living off royal connections. None of this was true. Roddy genuinely cared for Margaret. He wasn't using her. But the label stuck. By 1979, Roddy was exhausted. The constant press attention, the public judgment, the inability to establish his own identity. He was 31 years old, and he'd accomplished nothing on his own. Everything he had came from his association with Margaret. It was emasculating. He started to pull away. He stopped visiting Mustique as frequently. He'd make excuses. "I have work commitments. I'm busy with a project. I need some time." Margaret knew what was happening. She could feel him slipping away. And it destroyed her. Because Roddy wasn't just a boyfriend. He was validation. Validation that she was still desirable, still relevant, still lovable. After the scandal, after the divorce, after the public humiliation, Roddy had been her proof that someone still wanted her. Losing him meant admitting she'd sacrificed everything, her reputation, her dignity, her family's trust, for a relationship that was ending anyway. The thought was unbearable. So Margaret became desperate. She'd call Roddy constantly, leave messages, ask when he was visiting. She'd send gifts, money, offers to pay for projects. Roddy felt trapped. He cared for Margaret. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't stay. He needed to live his own life. In 1980, the relationship was effectively over. They still saw each other occasionally, but the intimacy was gone. Then, in early 1981, Roddy met someone new. Her name was Tanya Soskin. She was 30 years old, from a wealthy family, artistic, independent. Roddy fell in love. Not the complicated, unequal love he'd had with Margaret, something simpler, more natural. With Tanya, he could be himself, not Princess Margaret's boyfriend, just Roddy. In July 1981, Roddy married Tanya. The wedding was small, private, just family and close friends. Margaret was invited through a formal letter. Polite, but distant. She didn't attend. She couldn't. The humiliation would have been too much. Attending would mean watching Roddy marry someone else, someone younger, someone who could give him the normal life Margaret never could. So she stayed home, sent a gift, a silver frame, expensive but impersonal. The relationship was over. And here's the devastating part. Mustique now represented that failure, too. Les Jolies Eaux had been the primary location of their romance. Almost every significant moment happened there. Their first vacation together in 1974. Their most intimate times together. Their final visits before the breakup. The villa held every memory of Roddy. The beach where they'd walked holding hands. The pool where they'd swum together. The piano where she'd played while he sang. The bedroom where they'd slept together. Every corner of Les Jolies Eaux reminded her of what she'd lost. So when Margaret looked at Mustique now, she didn't see paradise. She saw Roddy. She saw the man who'd left her. She saw the years she'd wasted. She saw proof of her failure, and she couldn't bear it. In 1981, Margaret visited Mustique only once, for 4 days in January. She arrived alone, no friends, no staff beyond the essential villa employees. She stayed inside mostly. Didn't go to the beach, didn't visit Colin Tennant, didn't socialize. On the third evening, a villa staff member heard her crying in the living room. Margaret was sitting at the piano, not playing, just sitting, crying. The staff member quietly left. This wasn't something to intrude upon. Margaret left the next day, earlier than planned. She told staff she wasn't feeling well. Colin Tennant was worried. He called her in London. "Margaret, you should bring friends next time. Make new memories." "Perhaps," Margaret said, but her voice was flat, defeated. Making new memories meant acknowledging the old ones, and the old memories hurt too much. But there was another problem developing, something nobody expected, something that would make returning to Mustique physically impossible. Let's examine Margaret's health decline in detail. In 1978, Margaret was 48 years old. Still relatively healthy, still active. Yes, she smoked. Yes, she drank. But she'd done that for decades. She could still walk unassisted, travel internationally, perform royal duties. But decades of abuse were catching up. Margaret smoked 60 cigarettes daily. That's 3 full packs. She'd started smoking at age 15 in 1945. By her late 40s, she'd been smoking for over 30 years. The damage was cumulative and severe. She had chronic bronchitis, a persistent cough that never went away, shortness of breath, reduced lung capacity. Her drinking was equally destructive. She drank heavily, whiskey, gin, vodka, often starting at lunch and continuing past midnight. A typical day: 2 whiskeys before lunch, wine with lunch, gin and tonic in the afternoon, cocktails before dinner, wine with dinner, more whiskey after dinner. Conservative estimates put her daily alcohol consumption at 8 to 10 units. That's about 4 times the recommended amount for women. Her diet was poor. Rich foods, high fat, low vegetables. She loved cream sauces, butter, red meat. She exercised minimally. Some swimming when at Mustique. Occasional walks, nothing regular. Add chronic stress from the scandals, depression, and decades of royal pressure. Her body was breaking down, but she ignored all warnings. She refused to slow down. Doctors repeatedly advised her to quit smoking. She'd cut back to 40 cigarettes, then creep back up to 60. They told her to stop drinking. She'd switch from whiskey to wine, pretending that made a difference. They recommended exercise, better diet, stress management. She ignored it all. Then, in 1985, something happened that changed everything. Margaret began experiencing severe chest pain, persistent coughing, blood in her sputum. Tests revealed a lesion in her left lung. Cancer was suspected. In March 1985, she underwent surgery at the Brompton Hospital in London. Surgeons removed part of her left lung, a full lobectomy, removal of an entire lobe. Pathology revealed the tissue was precancerous, not yet malignant, but heading that way. The surgery saved her life, but it also changed it permanently. Margaret was 55 years old. The recovery was brutal. She spent 2 weeks in hospital, then 6 weeks of restricted activity. The pain was intense. Every breath hurt. Coughing was agony. Moving was difficult, and she was terrified. For the first time, Margaret confronted her mortality. She'd nearly had lung cancer. She'd nearly died. Doctors told her to quit smoking immediately. This time, she tried. For 3 months, she stopped completely. It was torture. She was irritable, anxious, couldn't sleep, gained weight. By July 1985, she was smoking again, down to 20 cigarettes daily. Still too many, but better than 60. They told her to stop drinking. She reduced to wine only. Still too much, but better than spirits. But the real damage was done. Between 1985 and 1993, Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly. In 1986, she developed pneumonia, hospitalized for 10 days, treated with antibiotics and oxygen therapy. In 1988, another bout of pneumonia, even more severe, 2 weeks in hospital. In 1989, chronic bronchitis flared badly. She was put on permanent medication, inhalers, steroids, bronchodilators. Her mobility decreased. She walked with difficulty. Stairs became challenging. She'd get winded after climbing just 1 flight. Her energy levels collapsed. She tired easily, needed afternoon naps, canceled engagements, and she developed severe depression. This wasn't just sadness. This was clinical depression. She'd wake in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. She'd cry without reason. She lost interest in activities she once loved. She stopped playing piano, stopped reading as much, stopped entertaining friends. Her doctor prescribed antidepressants. They helped somewhat, but the underlying issues remained, because Margaret wasn't just physically sick. She was psychologically damaged. The scandals, the divorce, Roddy leaving, her children growing up and leaving home, her declining role in the royal family. Everything that had defined her was slipping away, but she still tried to visit Mustique occasionally. In 1986, she spent 2 weeks there in January. It was difficult. The heat exhausted her. The humidity made breathing hard. She couldn't walk to the beach without becoming winded. She spent most of the time indoors with air conditioning, reading, resting. Not the active social visits of earlier years. Staff noticed the change. She seemed frail, old, defeated. In 1988, she visited for 1 week. She spent most of it inside. She'd sit on the terrace in the early morning when it was cool. But by 10 a.m., the heat was too much. She'd retreat indoors, draw the curtains, turn up the air conditioning. Colin Tennant visited. He was shocked by her appearance. She'd aged dramatically. She looked 70, not 58. Her skin was gray, her breathing labored. "Margaret, perhaps Mustique isn't good for you anymore," he suggested gently. "The heat, the humidity, the travel." "I need to keep trying," Margaret said. "I can't lose this too." But she was losing it. She'd already lost it. She just couldn't admit it yet. By 1990, she hadn't visited Mustique in 2 years. The travel had become too difficult, the journey too exhausting. Because here's what people don't understand. Getting to Mustique required enormous physical effort. First, a car ride from Kensington Palace to Heathrow Airport, about an hour in London traffic. Then, an 8-hour flight from London to Barbados. 8 hours sitting in a pressurized cabin, breathing recycled air. For someone with reduced lung capacity, this was extremely difficult. Margaret had to use supplemental oxygen during flights. Then, a 90-minute connection to St. Vincent, another plane, more sitting, more recycled air. Then, a 30-minute boat ride to Mustique, across open water, bouncing over waves. For someone with mobility issues, this was challenging. Getting in and out of boats, maintaining balance, that's over 10 hours of travel, each way. For a healthy person, manageable, if tiring. For Margaret with lung damage, mobility issues, and chronic health problems, excruciating. Each trip to Mustique required weeks of recovery afterward, so she stopped going. The villa sat empty. Staff continued maintaining it, but Margaret didn't visit. In 1991, no visits. In 1992, no visits. In 1993, no visits. For 3 years, Les Jolies Eaux sat unused, a $2.1 million villa, fully staffed, immaculately maintained, but empty. Colin tenants suggested renting it out, generate income, at least someone would use it. Margaret refused. "It's my villa," she said. "I'll visit when I'm better." But she wasn't getting better. She was getting worse. And deep down, Margaret knew she'd never return. Not because she couldn't physically, but because she couldn't emotionally. Because returning meant confronting everything the villa represented, her scandals, her failures, her losses, and she wasn't strong enough for that anymore. But even that wasn't the final blow. The final blow came in 1998. Now, let's look at the event that ended Margaret's relationship with Mustique forever. On February 23, 1998, Margaret suffered a stroke. She was 67 years old. She was at her home in Kensington Palace when it happened. Mid-afternoon, around 3 p.m., she was having tea with a lady-in-waiting, discussing an upcoming royal engagement. Suddenly, Margaret felt dizzy. The room spun. Her left side went numb. "I don't feel well," she said. Then she collapsed. The lady-in-waiting immediately called for help. Palace staff called an ambulance. Within 15 minutes, paramedics arrived. They assessed her quickly. Stroke symptoms, left side weakness, slurred speech. She was rushed to King Edward VII's Hospital in London, the private hospital used by the royal family. Doctors confirmed cerebrovascular accident, an ischemic stroke. A blood clot had blocked an artery in her brain. Brain tissue was dying from lack of oxygen. They administered clot-busting drugs immediately. Time was critical. The damage was moderate, not catastrophic, but significant. She lost substantial mobility in her left leg. Her left arm was weakened. Her speech slurred slightly. Her balance was severely affected. Margaret spent 3 weeks in hospital. The first week in intensive care, being monitored constantly. The second week in a regular room, beginning basic rehabilitation. The third week, preparing for discharge. Then she moved to a rehabilitation facility for 6 months. Physical therapy every day. Occupational therapy, speech therapy, learning to walk with a cane, learning to compensate for left side weakness, learning to speak clearly despite facial weakness. It was grueling, humiliating, exhausting. Margaret was 67 years old. She'd been independent her entire life. Now she needed help with basic tasks, getting dressed, bathing, walking across a room. She hated it. By August 1998, she'd recovered partially. She could walk with a cane, she could speak clearly enough, but she was fundamentally changed, weaker, frailer, more dependent. Her energy was severely limited. Long journeys were not just exhausting but potentially dangerous. She needed assistance constantly, and Mustique became impossible, not just difficult, medically impossible. Her doctors were explicit: no long-distance travel, no tropical climates, no remote locations. The 10-hour journey could trigger another stroke. The exertion could be fatal. The heat and humidity of Mustique could cause dangerous dehydration, potentially triggering another stroke. The isolation meant limited access to emergency medical care. If she had another stroke on Mustique, she could die before reaching a proper hospital. The royal family was insistent. The Queen herself intervened, making it clear. Mustique was off limits. Even Colin Tennant, Margaret's old friend and the man who'd given her the land, agreed it was too risky. "Margaret, you can't visit anymore," he said during a phone call in late 1998. "It's not safe. I'm saying this because I love you." But Margaret didn't argue. And that's what's fascinating. She seemed almost relieved, relief that she finally had a medical excuse, a legitimate, unquestionable reason to never return. She didn't have to admit that Mustique had become painful. She didn't have to explain that every memory hurt. She didn't have to confess that she'd been avoiding the villa for years anyway. She could simply say, "Doctor's orders." And nobody would question it. Nobody could judge her. It was medical fact, not emotional weakness. In some ways, the stroke freed her from the burden of pretending she still wanted to visit. In 1998, after the stroke, Margaret didn't visit Mustique. In 1999, she didn't visit. By January 2000, she'd suffered another stroke, this one more severe. She was at home again when it happened. Similar symptoms: dizziness, numbness, collapse. This stroke was worse. It affected her right side now, too. She became wheelchair-bound. She couldn't walk unassisted anymore. She required full-time nursing care. A nurse lived at Kensington Palace, attending to Margaret 24 hours a day. Margaret needed help with everything: dressing, bathing, eating, moving from bed to wheelchair. Her speech became more slurred, sometimes difficult to understand. Her cognitive function declined. She'd forget conversations, repeat herself, seem confused. She was 69 years old, but she looked and functioned like someone much older. Mustique was completely, utterly, absolutely out of the question now. But here's what nobody talks about. Margaret never asked about the villa, never inquired about its condition, never requested photographs, never wanted updates. When staff mentioned Mustique in conversation, she'd change the subject. When Colin Tennant called to check on her, she'd ask about his health, his family, anything except the island. It was as if Les Jolies Eaux didn't exist anymore, as if it had never existed. Staff continued maintaining the property. They had to. Margaret hadn't given instructions to stop. They cleaned it weekly, dusted every surface, changed the linens on all the beds. They maintained the pool, kept the water crystal clear, cleaned the filters. They tended the gardens, watered the plants, trimmed the hedges, kept everything pristine. They repaired anything that broke, fixed leaking taps, replaced worn furniture, touched up paint. The villa was perfect, ready for occupancy at any moment, but Margaret never came. Week after week, month after month, year after year, the villa sat empty. Beautiful, maintained, unused, a $2.1 million Caribbean mansion, completely abandoned by its owner. The irony was profound. Margaret had spent years avoiding Mustique emotionally. Now she was prevented physically. But the outcome was the same. The villa was empty. The paradise was lost. And when Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at age 71, the property transferred to her estate. She'd suffered another stroke in early 2002, this one while on holiday in Mustique, not her villa, but Colin Tennant's Cotton House Hotel. Wait, she was on Mustique when she had her final stroke? This requires explanation. In early 2002, Margaret's children, David Linley and Sarah Chatto, decided their mother needed a vacation. She'd been depressed, isolated, her health was deteriorating further. They arranged for her to visit Mustique. Not her own villa, that was too emotionally loaded, but Colin Tennant's hotel. The idea was, get her back to the island, but in a neutral location. Maybe it would lift her spirits. Margaret agreed. She was curious, perhaps, or maybe she'd simply given up resisting. She traveled to Mustique in January 2002. The journey was difficult, requiring medical staff to accompany her. She stayed at the Cotton House Hotel, in a suite, not her villa, just a few miles away. For 3 days she seemed okay, tired but peaceful. Then, on the 4th day, she had another stroke. Massive this time. She was flown back to London immediately, hospitalized at King Edward VII's Hospital. She never recovered consciousness. On February 9, 2002, at 6:30 a.m., Princess Margaret died. The cause of death: cardiac complications following a stroke. She was 71 years old. The funeral was held on February 15, 2002, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The Queen attended. Prince Philip, Prince Charles, all the senior royals. Her children, David and Sarah, were devastated. The coffin was draped with her personal standard, covered in flowers. After the service, Margaret's body was cremated. Her ashes were interred beside her parents in St. George's Chapel. Within months, her estate began settling her affairs. Les Jolies Eaux was listed for sale. The asking price: £2.4 million, about $9.5 million in 2002 dollars. The real estate listing described it as 5-bedroom villa on private Caribbean island, spectacular views, fully furnished, staff quarters, pool, gardens, historical significance. It sold quickly. Too quickly, some thought. Jim Murray, an American businessman, purchased it for the asking price. No negotiation. He'd made his fortune in media and entertainment. He wanted a Caribbean retreat. But he didn't want Margaret's villa, he wanted the location. Within 6 months of purchase, Murray demolished the original structure, completely demolished it, tore it down to the foundation, the Balinese pavilions, the open-air living room, the custom furniture, the ceramic tiles, the tropical gardens, all gone. Murray built a modern villa in its place, contemporary design, clean lines, minimalist aesthetic. He renamed it, not Les Jolies Eaux, something else, something without history. All traces of Princess Margaret were erased. The villa she built, the paradise she loved, the prison she couldn't escape, gone, demolished, erased from physical reality. Only the memories remained, and even those were fading. Princess Margaret's exile from Mustique faded from public memory because almost every institution involved had a reason to bury it. After her death, Buckingham Palace shaped the narrative through controlled biographies that emphasized glamour, charity, and artistic work while deliberately minimizing the emotional destruction tied to Les Jolies Eaux. These accounts mentioned Roddy Llewellyn and the scandal, but never connected the events to the profound psychological trauma that made the villa uninhabitable for her. The royal family avoided the real story because it revealed vulnerability and showed that even royalty can be broken by humiliation, heartbreak, and the loss of sanctuary. Popular culture also played a role in burying the truth. Movies, books, and series like The Crown prefer the glamorous version of Margaret, the witty, stylish, tragic, but beautiful princess, because that image entertains and sells. The truth is far sadder. Margaret stopped visiting Mustique not because of health or aging, but because the island had become psychologically toxic. It held memories too painful to face, memories that shattered the myth of royal resilience and replaced it with emotional fragility. That version of Margaret simply does not fit the marketable fantasy. The deeper reason this story disappeared is that it forces an uncomfortable psychological truth into the open. Scandal does not only affect people, it infects places. Les Jolies Eaux absorbed Margaret's humiliation so completely that the villa itself became a trauma site. Every room, every view, and every familiar path triggered emotions tied to the scandal. This phenomenon, where spaces become inseparable from traumatic memories, is well known in psychology, yet rarely discussed publicly. People prefer to believe trauma can be overcome with time, renovation, or willpower. Margaret's avoidance of Mustique shows that some damage is permanent and some places cannot be reclaimed. Her exile also exposed the brutal cost of constant surveillance. Margaret's private retreat was invaded by photographers who stalked her from offshore, captured intimate moments without consent, and triggered a global scandal. The media profited immensely from the images while ignoring the long-term psychological wreckage they caused. Acknowledging her exile would require acknowledging that intrusive journalism can destroy a person's relationship with the one place they once considered safe. The press has no incentive to confront that truth. Margaret's relationship with Roddy Llewellyn turned Mustique into a geography of memories she could not escape. Since most of their time together happened at the villa, the entire property became a monument to a relationship that ended painfully. Emotional association overpowered financial value. Even though the villa was worth millions, the memories were worth far more in emotional cost. This pattern is universal, but society avoids it because it challenges the belief that money or privilege can protect people from emotional suffering. Her story also threatens the popular idea that wealth shields people from psychological harm. In reality, Margaret had every material advantage: wealth, staff, property, influence, but still lost her sanctuary to trauma. Her life shows that emotional pain does not respect privilege. The story is avoided because it forces us to accept that anyone, regardless of status, can be overwhelmed by heartbreak and humiliation. Another reason the story is forgotten is simply because it is too sad. There is no redemption, no triumphant return, and no healing. Margaret built a paradise, lost it to scandal, and never reclaimed it. She spent the rest of her life avoiding the place she once loved until her children finally sold the villa after her death. It is a tragic ending that contradicts the fairy tale expectations people place on royalty. Margaret's experience mirrors contemporary examples that reveal the same psychological pattern. Tiger Woods abandoned his Florida mansion after the 2009 scandal because the property became a trigger for humiliation and the collapse of his marriage. Johnny Depp stopped visiting his private island because it carried painful memories of failed relationships and public disgrace. Lottery winners flee their dream mansions when the homes become reminders of isolation, pressure, or broken relationships. Divorcing couples sell houses at losses because every room carries emotional residue. Veterans avoid deployment locations long after conflicts end because the geography itself rekindles trauma. In every case, emotional association overpowers practical or financial logic. Margaret's story demonstrates that locations absorb meaning. When a place becomes tied to humiliation, grief, or heartbreak, its physical value no longer matters. Human beings respond to emotional geography, not financial value. Margaret's $2.1 million villa eventually cost her over $145 million in opportunity losses, yet she kept it because selling it meant admitting there was no hope of return. The villa became a symbol of what she lost, and letting it go meant acknowledging defeat. Her children sold it immediately after her death because they understood what it represented. The man who gave her the land, Colin Tennant, also suffered losses. His gift elevated Mustique at first, but after the scandal, Margaret's presence drew paparazzi, caused privacy concerns, and deterred buyers. What was once a prestigious royal connection became a liability. Even after the villa was sold, the stigma remained so deeply attached to the structure that the new owner demolished the entire building. Renovation could not remove the association, only complete erasure could. Margaret's experience reveals a profound truth. Trauma has geography. Places can carry emotional weight, often becoming uninhabitable because they trigger memories that overwhelm the present. Her inability to return to Les Jolies Eaux mirrors the quiet, private avoidances in ordinary lives: restaurants tied to breakups, houses tied to failed marriages, streets tied to painful events, cities tied to grief. These avoidances are often unconscious and unspoken, but they follow the same psychological principle of place-dependent memory. Margaret renovated the villa repeatedly: new furniture, new colors, new landscaping, but nothing worked. You cannot redecorate trauma. The emotional imprint of a place cannot be removed with paint or furniture. When memory is tied to location, the place becomes a permanent trigger. Ultimately, Margaret's exile from Mustique is not just a royal story. It is a human story about how places become wounds. It shows that emotional pain can transform paradise into a prison, that trauma can linger in the walls of a house, and that even the most beautiful locations can become unbearable reminders of what was lost. The truth remains hidden because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. We are shaped not only by what happens to us, but by where it happens, and sometimes the only way to survive is to leave the place behind forever.